Good afternoon. Thank you for joining CRFB's first webinar of 2024, Riches to Rags, the Causes of Fiscal Deterioration. Since 2001, the country has turned a modest surplus into a $1.7 trillion deficit, while the national debt has tripled as a share of the economy. To explain how this happened, it is now my pleasure to introduce CRFB Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director, Marc Goldwein. After his presentation, he will be taking questions from the audience, so be sure to submit any questions you have using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Now, please welcome Marc.
Happy New Year's, folks. I just said that entire thing on mute, so I apologize for that. We've only been doing this since 2020. You can't expect me to remember to unmute my webinar, but I'm so glad that all of you are able to join us today for what I think should be a really interesting discussion of some exciting new analysis that we put together. Let me kind of start us off by taking us back to 2001. Now, 2001 was a really different time. Shaggy's It Wasn't Me what topped the charts. 24, the TV show, was just released. The first iPod became available, so you could listen to your music without, a Discman or a Walkman. And we were on course to paying off our national debt. In fact, if you look at the fiscal situation in 2001, that's the last year we had a surplus. We were running a surplus of $128 billion, meaning we were raising $128 billion more in taxes than we were spending out. That's over 1% of GDP. Our national debt was only $3 trillion, $3.3 trillion, which was about a third of the GDP. And we were projected to actually pay off our debt. At the time, at the beginning of 2001, we were projected to pay off our debt by 2009. We now know with better data, it would have taken somewhat longer than that in reality, but we were very much on course to pay off our debt. Now compare that to last year, 2023. Things look very different. Last year, we ran a $1.7 trillion deficit, meaning we borrowed about $2 trillion, but for various accounting reasons, the deficit was 1.7. That's over 6% of GDP, and actually the highest deficit the country's ever had as a share of the economy when we weren't either in a deep recession or a sort of a big war or something like that. Our debt was almost 100% of GDP, 98%, $26 trillion. And if you've read anything CRFB's written, you've known that our debt is projected to rise as far as the eye can see. Here's sort of more visual showing of that. You can see in 2001, that was our last year we were running a surplus. It wasn't a gigantic surplus, but it was a surplus. In 2002, we had modest deficits. They got a little bigger, then they got a little smaller, and then they got way bigger. And fast forward to present, they're $1.7 trillion, and probably they're going to continue to be that high or higher going forward. If you look at our national debt, we like to measure the national debt relative to the size of the economy. The bigger the economy, the more debt you can afford. Back in 2001, debt was about 32% of GDP, which actually had been about the historic average at the time. It stayed about there till about 2007. Then it jumped up a couple of times, and now it's about 98% of GDP. So our debt has tripled as a share of the economy since 2001. Now, what's caused this? What caused our small surpluses to become gigantic deficits? What caused our debt to triple? What caused our amazing fiscal outlook, where we are on course to pay off the debt, to be so horrible? There's lots of ideas out there. Wars, tax cuts, population aging, stimulus, healthcare costs. There's so many different theories. And some folks have actually done studies where they tried to answer this. For example, Bobby Kogan at the Center for American Progress did a study where he found that tax cuts were really the key drivers. CBO did a study, Congressional Budget Office, about a decade ago, where they found it was really a mix of things. Chuck Blauhaus did a study where he attributed most of what happened to legislation passed in the 60s under the Great Society. Brian Riedel has one where he showed that spending was the lead cause. There are all sorts of different studies with all sorts of different conclusions. And it turns out, we did the math, they're all basically right. How can that be? I'll talk about in a minute. But currently debt is 100% of GDP. Had we not had big tax cuts, it'd be about 60%. Had we not had big spending increases, it'd be about 65. And had we not had the growth of our major entitlement programs, it'd be about 50. A large any one of those explanations can explain a large portion of our debt. So what do we do in this paper, which I recommend everybody check out? It's called From Riches to Rags, and it explains how things got so bad since 2001. And when I say we, I really mean especially our senior policy analyst, Jordan Herring, who did the vast majority of the work on this paper. We looked at the question of what caused our debt to get worse and our deficits to get worse in two different ways. First, we asked, what has happened legislatively since 2001, and how has that affected the debt relative to where it otherwise would be? And looking that way, what we found is that tax cuts, spending increases, and response to the stimulus all played a pretty big role. And in fact, without any of those, debt would be paid off by now. Then we looked at this a different way, and we said, okay, it's helpful to understand what's happened legislatively, but it's also helpful to understand what's happened over time. What happened between 2001 and 2023 to explain how we turned surpluses into huge deficits. And there, again, it's a mixture of answers. Spending went way up, revenue went somewhat down. And let me get into more detail on all of this, but I can see there's already questions, and I encourage you to put them into the chat because we're going to have a good opportunity to talk as we go. Now, remember I said that debt tripled as a share of the economy since 2001. Back in 2001, it was 32%. Last year, it ended the year at 98%. That means it's tripled. What we tried to do is remove legislation and major executive actions, major legislation and major executive actions from the mix, and ask what would have happened otherwise. And basically what we find is, had we not had big spending increases for discretionary spending in Medicare, legislated spending increases, in other words, laws or executive actions that expanded spending higher than it otherwise would have been, debt would have been about 33% of GDP lower. Had we not had major tax cuts, these started in 2001 and 2003, they were extended in 2010 and 2012, and then we had the 2017 additional tax cuts. Absent those bills, debt would have been 37% of GDP lower. And had we not responded to the Great Recession and to the COVID crisis, had we not spent anything in response to those, and had the result not been any change in the economy, debt would be 28% of GDP lower. Add all these three things together, they actually add up to 98%, which means had we done none of this, debt would be paid off. In fact, debt would have been paid off a couple of years ago. And that would be the situation. Now, an interesting thing about this data is it allows you to tell basically whatever story you want, right? I could just look at this data and I could say, well, tax cuts are the problem. Because had we not done tax cuts and we had not had those one-time recession responses, debt would be 33% of GDP, almost identical to what it was in 2001. And so I could use this to say the entire growth of the debt is tax cuts and recession response. But of course, that's ignoring the spending increases. Or I could look at the same data and I could say pretty much the entirety of this is spending increases. Had it not been for discretionary spending increases, Medicare expansions, and the recession response, debt would be 37% of GDP today. That's only slightly higher than the 32% in 2001. So I could look at this and say, this is entirely a story of spending increases. Had it not been for spending increases, debt would be under control. But of course, that ignores the major tax cuts. The reality is these all made a difference. I should point out that many of these tax cuts, they weren't lowering revenue relative to where they were. They were lowering them relative to where they otherwise would be. Under the law, revenue tends to rise as a share of the economy as we get richer as a society. This is called real bracket creep. The idea is as people get richer, they move into higher brackets. That raises revenue. And so we try to smooth things out. So these are 5-year rolling averages to get rid of the jaggedness. But we try to show like what would have happened to revenue had there been no changes in tax law. And you can see it would have grown from about 10% of GDP to about 13%. Most of what we did, not all, but most of what we did was cut taxes to stop revenue from growing as a share of GDP. to keep it at about that 10% of GDP. This is just for income tax, excuse me. A similar situation with discretionary spending. I know a lot of people say, how could it be discretionary spending increases? The real problem is Social Security and Medicare. That's true in the sense, and I'll get to it, that Social Security and Medicare are the rising cost, but under the law, discretionary spending was slated to decline as a share of the economy. It was slated to only grow with the rate of inflation to keep up with ongoing needs. And so a lot of what we did was either one-time discretionary spending increases, especially for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also for other factors, or it was essentially stopping discretionary spending from shrinking as a share of the GDP. You can see that basically in 2003, it was about 6%. Today, it's only a little bit higher than 6%, but it would have been closer to 4 or 5% had we done nothing. And so when you look at this legislatively, let me go backwards for a second because I just want to show this whole thing. When you look at this legislatively, what you see is that we can explain the growth of the debt relative to where it otherwise would have been, or we can explain the entirety of the debt relative to what it otherwise been because of major tax cuts, major spending increases, and the response to the recession. But many of these responses, many of this legislation was basically just holding things constant at or near 2001 levels. I also want to say, before I get to the other way of looking at this, that both parties are very clearly to blame. We took the legislation, and by we, again, I mean Jordan, and we pulled it apart between legislation that was fully partisan, meaning 100% of the votes was one party, legislation that was extremely partisan, meaning the vast majority of the votes were one party, and legislation that was bipartisan, meaning that both parties contributed to it in some meaningful way. We found that 77% of GDP of the debt could be explained by bipartisan legislation, by our definition. A narrower definition that might go down to 50% if we really stretch the definition. But in any situation, the vast majority of this, both the tax cuts and the spending increases, had the support of both parties, had the support of a substantial number of people in both parties. And so when they try to blame each other, I just have to chuckle because they're both very much at fault for our current fiscal situation. Now, this first type of analysis basically explains why is debt so much higher than it otherwise would have been. But that doesn't tell us why is deficit and debt so high today relative to what it was in 2001, right? The problem with looking at this legislative change approach is it doesn't account for things like built-in growth, right? We know that Social Security and healthcare costs have built-in growth. Why? Post-Social Security and Medicare, because healthcare costs grow, because more and more people are eligible, because Social Security is wage indexed, all these things create built-in growth. That's already in the law. And so this doesn't account for the fact that politicians ignored these things and let them continue. It doesn't account for the fact that had we done nothing, revenue would have grown as the size of the economy forever, or discretionary spending would have shrank as the size of the economy pretty much forever. And it also ignores all legislation that passed before 2001 that could contribute to the deficit. And so while I think it's really useful to look at legislative changes and what they've done to the debt, it's also useful to look at what has happened between 2001 and 2023. And interestingly, when we ask that question, we get a similar answer, which is that both revenue and spending contribute, but for very different reasons, right? So in 2001, we ran a 1.2% of GDP surplus. In 2023, we ran a 6.3% deficit. Of that 7.5% of GDP difference, 2/3 of it is spending. 1/3 of it is revenue, meaning lower revenue as a share of the economy explains 1/3 of the increase in the deficit. Higher spending as a share of GDP explains 2/3. But unlike with our legislative changes, this isn't about discretionary barely at all. It's actually about our major entitlement programs. What we see is that the cost of healthcare is substantially larger than it was in 2001. This is the main factor driving it, the cost of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Those three combined explain about half of the total increase in the deficit. Increases in spending on everything else and reductions in revenue explain the other half. And so when we look at over time, what we see is, yes, both revenue and spending contribute, but it's really certain types of spending. And it's really the spending programs that are on autopilot, especially Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that are driving this. And you can kind of see in this chart here, it's a little obscured by the fact that we have these one-time pandemic and recession increases, but you can see that discretionary and other mandatory outside of emergency times remain relatively steady, but Social Security and healthcare are expanding. And just let me pull away discretionary and other mandatory so you can see it a little bit better. Back in 2001, Social Security major healthcare spending was about 8% of GDP. Now it's about 11%, headed towards 12%. These are the drivers of the widening of the deficit relative to 2001. Absent these drivers, we'd be in a much better situation. So we did a couple of thought experiments. One was, what would happen if we spent exactly the same as we actually did, but we had held revenue constant as a share of the economy at 2001 levels? Now, in practice, that would have meant a lot of tax increases and it would have been very jagged, but just as a thought experiment. Basically, debt would be cut in half. Debt would be 50% of GDP today instead of 98%. Then we did another thought experiment. What if we kept spending flat at 2001 levels, while we let revenue do its thing, do what it actually did? In that situation, debt would be 6% of GDP. It'd be on course to be paid off within just a few years. And then we tried to hold them both constant. In that situation, debt would have been paid off by 2011. The bottom line is, this isn't what happened legislatively, but it's a very important way to look at the situation. Our rising spending and declining revenue is key drivers of our deficit. We also looked at all these scenarios. What would the deficit be this year? Not just what would debt be, and what would the deficit be this year? Here you find the answer is under any of these scenarios, much lower. Without major spending increases, it'd be about $1 trillion instead of 1.7. Without major tax cuts, it'd be about 650 billion. Without either of them, we would actually be very, very close to balance. Had we held spending flat, we'd actually be in surplus. So you can look at these different ways, but what you find is that we'd have a much more manageable deficit. Had we not passed all these tax cuts, had we not passed all these spending increases, had we held spending from growing as a share of the economy, or had we held revenue from declining as a share of the economy, any of these things would have made a big difference. I do want to kind of give a nod to the appendix, which our team spent a lot of time. There are different ways of looking at this question, especially something like discretionary spending, where there's a baseline that assumes it grows with inflation. But after a decade, by sort of a weird convention, CBO assumes it grows with the economy. If you instead assume it continues to grow with inflation, which I think is probably a more appropriate way of thinking spending increases, then discretionary spending explains 40% of GDP instead of 33. On the other hand, if you assume that revenue doesn't keep rising as a share of GDP forever, it shrinks from 38% to 28%. If you assume they never, either revenue or spending changes as a share of GDP, you're at 20% each. The point here isn't to kind of get you confused with different numbers, but to say there are different ways of looking at this. The way that we chose, I think, is the most accurate and consistent with baseline concepts. But even if you look at any other way, you get a very similar story, which is that spending increases, tax cuts, and recession response all explain a lot of our deficit. And without any of those, without any one of those, our debt would be in a much better path. And without all of them, our debt would likely be paid off, or at least close to it. I can see we have a lot of questions, which I'm going to get to in a minute, but I also want to leave this with some important takeaways, because telling us how we got here doesn't necessarily tell us where to go. In fact, what I told you can't even tell you what's to blame. Asking whether tax cuts or spending increases are to blame is like asking which side of the scissors is doing the cutting. I can't tell you that spending is too high or that taxes are too low. That's a judgment call. That's a values call. In some ways, it's an analytical call based on economic and distributional outcomes. You can't do it by just saying how much have they contribute to the debt. What we can tell you is how have changes to revenue and how changes to spending influenced the debt. And what we find is that both have significantly. Now, that doesn't mean we can just go back. You can't go back to 2001. For starters, we can't change the past, right? So we already have 100% of GDP of debt. And a lot of that debt was from policies that were temporary. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were not continuing to spend on in a meaningful way. COVID relief, other than a little bit of employee retention credit, is essentially over. Great Recession response is over. We can't go back in time and change that. And even if we were to go back to the 2001 law, it would have very significant implications that I think we're not ready for. It would mean much higher tax rates, way smaller child tax credit. A fourth of taxpayers would be the alternative minimum tax. Like, it was reasonable that some changes did need to be made to the tax code between 2001 and 2023. And some of the changes that we did make were for the better, even though others were extremely costly and probably not worth it. It would also mean no Medicare drug benefit, huge cuts to the military and homeland security, big domestic cuts. So it's just not realistic that we're going to go back to 2001 law, nor can we go back to 2001 levels. We are a much older population today than we were in 2001. There are many more people on Social Security and Medicare. If we were to try to snap our fingers and go back to 2001 spending levels, it would have to mean substantial immediate cuts to people currently on the program that didn't plan for those, or 15% across the board tax hike for everyone. This just isn't going to happen. It's helpful to know how we got here, but we can't go back and unwind the past. All we can do is move forward. Now, I do think, in part by coincidence, in part not, moving forward, we can take the same kinds of lessons, which is that we're very unlikely to be able to solve this problem entirely by cutting spending or entirely by increasing taxes. We've done the math on this, and you'd have to have pretty dramatic spending cuts to balance the budget, cut spending by a quarter, raise taxes by a third almost. And that's assuming you have everything on the table. A lot of politicians want to say, don't touch Social Security, or don't touch veterans, or don't touch defense, or don't touch people making less than $400,000. You make those promises, it goes from completely unrealistic to totally impossible to solve this problem. So in my opinion, it's very unlikely that we're going to fix our debt without looking at both revenue and spending. And in fact, that's exactly what we did in our 2002 blueprint to fix the debt and inflation. And I recommend you all check it out. But we looked especially at healthcare, but also tax reform, discretionary spending, energy, including things like carbon tax, Social Security and payroll taxes, and lots of other reforms. You're going to have to look at all parts of the budget, because we're going to need trillions of dollars, probably $8 trillion, although we'll know soon, in order to get our debt under control. And we're not going to do that from tax increases alone or spending cuts alone, especially if we're only looking at small parts of the budget or small numbers of taxpayers. With that, I would love to take any questions that folks have.
Thank you, Mark, so much for that. Definitely a lot of information to digest, and some really great slides. A bunch of people have asked, and yes, we will be sharing the slides as well as a recording of this presentation on our website after it's done, and everybody who attended will also get an email with a link to all of that. So let's jump into the questions. There are a lot of them, very robust group here. Warren would like to know more of a technical question. He sees federal debt to GDP as 122.5% and wants to know why you report on publicly held debt instead.
Thanks. So debt held by the public is about 100% of GDP, something like $27 trillion, 28. Gross federal debt is 34 trillion, about 130% of GDP. But gross federal debt includes money that we owe ourselves. And in particular, it includes money that the Social Security, the government general fund owes the Social Security Trust Fund, which means it's debt to the general fund, $3 trillion worth, but it's an asset to the Social Security Trust Fund, also $3 trillion worth in that case. And from an all of government perspective, those cancel out. From the perspective of thinking about markets, those cancel out because those bonds never go up for sale. From the perspective of thinking about effect on the economy, those cancel out because they never crowd out private investment. However you're thinking about this in sort of an economic fiscal situation, that extra debt we owe ourselves doesn't really matter. Where it does matter a bit is for understanding our future obligations. But even there, it's only sort of a partial estimate because it explains the obligations we owe out of our trust fund, but not the unfunded liabilities beyond our trust fund, whether it's for continuing Social Security and Medicare payments, or for paying for Medicare's Part B and D that aren't in trust funds, or for paying for defense or things like that. And then, of course, it also matters legally when it comes to our statutory debt limit, but there it's not share of GDP, it's a fixed dollar amount. So we stick with the number that's more economically meaningful, which is also what people like the Congressional Budget Office, the Office of Management and Budget, the GAO, and other official sources rely on.
Great. We've had a couple of questions, and as I'm not sure if you know, but the Federal Reserve just announced that they are going to be holding the funds rate at 5.25 to 5.5%. And people are curious, how does this elevated interest rate affect our interest paid on the debt?
Well, it's not good is the short answer. For the last 15 years, and especially the last 12 years or so, 10 years, the federal government has mostly benefited from really historically low interest rates. Often interest rates below the inflation rate, almost always below the rate of economic growth. And that's been good news in a narrow sense. It's been good news because it means that we could sort of grow our way out of our old debt. There's this concept of like R&G, and basically the idea is if your economic growth is faster than your interest rate, then all your old debt is going to erode because it's going to grow slower than it's going to erode relative to GDP. And that's been helpful for us. That's no longer the case. If you look across the Treasury yield curve, interest rates are mostly 4 to 5%, some are even above 5%, whereas we're expected economic growth rate is something like 3.8%. And so that means our interest rate is now not only above our inflation rate, but above our growth rate. And that ultimately leads to an unsustainable fiscal situation. It's already caused our interest costs to basically double as a share of the economy since 2020. Last year, the federal government spent more on interest than everything it spent on kids. Within 3 years or so, we're probably going to spend more on interest than we spend on defense. And if interest rates don't come down, or worse, if they go up further as we borrow more, the situation will only get worse. Interest will eventually become the single largest federal government program. Under the latest estimates, that'll happen in about 25 years. And eventually, we'll start spiraling out of control in a way that could lead to some kind of fiscal crisis. So it's not a good news when your interest rates are so high. And the solution is deficit reduction. And that's true for 2 reasons, maybe 3. First of all, the less debt we have, the less debt we're paying interest on. And so that means less risk of things like debt spiral and interest costs. But secondly, there's a relationship between debt and interest. When we reduce our debt, we actually put downward pressure on interest rates, and that can help get us out of this conundrum.
Great. And a quick follow-up, I think quick. What is the average interest rate paid on the federal debt at this time? One of our viewers thinks it's around 3%. Is that accurate?
That's right. So on total debt, we're paying about 3% now, but that's only so low. I put low in quotes, but that's only so low because we have this legacy debt that we borrowed, especially during the Great Recession when interest rates were like especially during the COVID crisis, when interest rates were below 1% at some point, but also other periods. We have this legacy debt that's paying really low interest rates of 1 or 2%. All of the new debt that we're issuing is between 4 and 5%, possibly a little bit higher than 5%. And so as our debt rolls over, and by the way, 1/3 of debt rolls over each year. As our debt rolls over, our existing debt is going to start paying closer and closer to what our new debt is paying. And what our new debt is paying is unsustainable.
Yeah, very, very scary indeed. Ken and Peg bring up the point that a bunch of people and organizations have been warning of our unsustainable fiscal condition for decades to no avail. And they would like to know, why will Congress act now versus all of the times in the past? What's going to give them the courage, leadership, and conviction to take the necessary actions?
Well, I don't know why they will act now, but I will say I'm more encouraged today than I've been any time in the last 8 years at least. And I'm encouraged because what I've seen recently is sort of a turning point in how the politicians are talking about fiscal policy. From 2015 or so through 2022, all politicians did was add to the deficit. They had a tax cut, they'd add to the deficit. They had a spending increase, they'd add to the deficit. They've barely paid for anything at all. In 2022, that started to shift with the Inflation Reduction Act. If you remember, originally there was this Build Back Better, which was this gigantic package that was going to add a lot to the deficit. They then switched it to the Inflation Reduction Act, which was not perfect, and based on newer estimates, probably actually increased the deficit or was about neutral a bit. But at the time, it was scored as deficit reducing, and more importantly, it was passed with the goal of being fully paid for. They had offsets to make sure that the new spending wasn't added to the deficit. This was the first time we had really had offsets to pay for big legislation. Then we followed that with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And this was bipartisan. Speaker McCarthy and President Biden negotiated this deal. This is a bipartisan package that reduced the deficit by $1.5 trillion over a decade. Now we have two pieces of legislation in the House and Senate to put forward a fiscal commission that are really building a lot of momentum. And so I'm optimistic because I kind of see this turn. It's too slow. We need the politicians to move a lot faster given our interest rates, given our fiscal situation. But you're seeing this turn from just wanting to cut taxes and increase spending without paying for it, to paying for things, to doing deficit reduction, to putting forward a commission that can look at some of the harder choices. And I wouldn't say I'm optimistic. That's too strong. But I'm encouraged that we're moving in the right direction and hopeful that we'll start moving there a little bit more quickly.
Great. Bob and Jim both asked similar questions about our projections. Roughly, if we raise taxes and cut spending by the amounts that would get us closer to budget neutral, have we run any modeling that shows what the further erosion of tax revenues would be from a projected slower economy?
Well, when it comes to tax increases and spending cuts, first of all, it matters what, right? It matters how. Not all. It's true. Raising tax rates, for example, or cutting certain types of investment incentives, those can slow economic growth somewhat. On the other hand, cutting distorting tax breaks, like the state and local tax deduction or the mortgage deduction or the health exclusion, or moving the tax code towards more consumption tax or things like that, those can actually, closing various loopholes, those can actually promote economic growth by improving economic efficiency. Same thing on the spending side. If we try to solve this entirely by cutting infrastructure and research, that's going to be somewhat anti-growth. On the other hand, if we focus on reforms to Social Security and Medicare that encourage people to work longer, that lower overall healthcare costs for everybody, those are going to promote growth. So my first point is it's about maximizing the right types of revenue increases and the right types of spending cuts. I say maximizing because we're never going to get to the state where all of them are pro-growth. But the first step is let's focus most on the pro-growth. And then you need to consider not only the negative effects of any not pro-growth tax increases or not pro-growth spending cuts, but the positive effects of the deficit reduction. And I think when you look at, for the most part, what we find is that the debt reduction does more good for the economy than most kinds of tax increases and spending cuts do bad for the economy. And so, we got to do this right. If we try to solve the debt entirely by things that are bad for economic growth, we'll have done it wrong. But deficit reduction itself is hugely pro-growth. And there's tremendous opportunity to look at tax reforms and spending reforms that actually grow the economy further, rather than ones that stifle it.
Great. Anthony is curious that given 2/3 of the federal budget is entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare that are basically uncontrollable, in his words, how can we realistically reduce the deficit when both parties are focusing only on 1/3 of the budget?
Yeah, well, we're going to get both parties to wake up. Now, I don't want to dismiss 1/3 of the budget. People don't realize that 1/3 is actually quite big. And so it's actually really important we put in place caps on discretionary spending. We got to extend those caps forward. That is really important. But what we really need is for them to wake up to the other 2/3. And on healthcare, there's actually pretty good news here. If you look at the old Obama budgets and the old Trump budgets, tons of overlap because there's actually a lot of bipartisan agreement on ways to lower healthcare costs for everyone, for the government and for the beneficiary. There are policies like site-neutral payments where we stop paying more for the exact same procedure if it's done by a hospital or hospital and clinic that have the support of Elizabeth Warren and Newt Gingrich. Medicare Advantage, there's tremendous amount of overpayments that everybody understands. So in healthcare, I'm pretty optimistic that once they get past the meta-scare where they're just beating each other over the head for cuts, they'll realize there's actually really broad agreement on what to do. Social Security is tougher because in Social Security, there's not a lot of pure waste. But there are reforms we can do that makes the program more efficient, that are more pro-growth, that target retirement security to people that actually need it most and not to people that are wealthy and can afford to save on their own. And the cost of inaction on Social Security is just so high that I'm hopeful that'll urge us to action. And what I mean by that is the law says when Social Security is insolvent, benefits have to be cut across the board. And that's just 9 years from today. So we've done the math on this. Again, my colleague Jordan, I think, ran the numbers, but in 9 years' time in 2033, when Social Security runs out, a typical newly retired couple will face a $17,400 cut in their annual benefits. $17,000 a year. Hopefully that's enough to wake politicians up and realize that, hey, maybe asking people 25 years from now to work 1 year longer to pay a bit more in taxes, and if they're rich to get a little bit less in benefits, is way better than dramatically cutting their benefits by $17,000 in 9 years. And so, again, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful.
A couple of people have mentioned the IRS and how that can factor into this equation. One specifically said, would we not be able to increase revenue by increasing staffing and computer resources at the IRS? Because she's heard that investment in those areas can generate real energistic returns.
Yeah, there are only a few places in the budget where like a tax cut or a spending increase will actually pay for itself. And adequately funding the IRS is one of them. We did that in the Inflation Reduction Act. We gave the IRS an extra $80 billion, which, to be honest, is probably at about the edge of what they can manage right now. I think it's important that we protect that money. There's a lot of calls to cut it back, and we should avoid that. But at this point, it's not about getting the IRS more money. It's about now giving them the other tools to use that money effectively, whether it's authority, whether it's information reporting, things like that. And then at some point, we should be reviewing how they're doing, and assuming they're doing well, and I think they will be, we need to extend that money because it expires in 2021. And so really important to make sure the IRS is adequately funded for sure. But at current moment, their problem isn't that they don't have enough money because we just gave them this huge pot. And so the issue is we need to protect that pot and make sure they're using it efficiently.
Great. Rob wants to know a little bit more of a technical question. Do we attach too much importance to the ratio of debt to GDP as opposed to the absolute level of debt? Does an increase in debt accompanied by a proportional increase in GDP necessarily imply the same fiscal risk?
I guess I would think about it this way. If you make $50,000 a year and you have a $5 million mortgage, you're probably in trouble. But if you make $20 million a year and you have a $5 million mortgage, it's probably not that big a deal, right? And also congratulations on making $20 million a year. That sounds great. The same is true for the federal government. The richer we are, the more debt we can afford. Debt to GDP is not a perfect measure. It doesn't account for our changing ability to collect that GDP through revenue, doesn't account for the changing costs of that debt through interest rates. And so it's not a perfect measure, but it's a pretty darn good measure that I think helps us understand how sustainable or not sustainable is our debt, how affordable or not affordable is our debt. And also lets us compare over time and against other countries.
Great. So I think the two people asked a very similar question, but from two completely different perspectives, which I think actually adds a lot to this conversation because there are so many different ways to attack this issue. One person asked, couldn't we increase our levels of immigration to help increase the amount of people paying into entitlement programs like Social Security to help make them more solvent? And then somebody else asked, isn't the influx of all of the migrants coming into the country actually hurting our entitlement programs? Do you have a specific take on that kind of paradox between the two sides?
So in general, when it comes to Social Security, immigration is a net benefit, at least for a while. The reason is that we don't get a lot of 65-year-old migrants, right? And if we did, they wouldn't be eligible for Social Security because Social Security, you have to have 10 years of wage history. We get migrants that are working age and are contributing to the payroll tax. And some of the migrants we get are working illegally under a fake Social Security number. Those are actually, ironically, the best ones from the federal government's perspective because they pay in and they never get benefits out. Of course, there's other reasons we don't want people to be working on an undocumented basis. But from a Social Security perspective, immigration is a net benefit, especially up front. Now, it's not a solution to Social Security. And the reason it's not a solution is the problem with immigrants is they get old, just like everybody else, right? And so more immigrants today means more revenue coming in today, but it would mean more money going out in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And so I think a thoughtful immigration reform could be a good supplement to a thoughtful Social Security reform, and a supplement not just from a fiscal perspective, from also an economic perspective. We used to have 3% growth in this country. Now we have 2% growth. The difference is basically no more labor force growth. And so we can address that in part with immigration. We can address that in part by helping marginal workers, older workers who want to stay in the workforce. Turns out it's better for them in many cases. They have, people that work longer tend to live longer as a result, are healthier physically and mentally, stronger social networks, more friends, less time watching TV, less time drinking. They have more savings, lower divorce rates because they're not at home annoying their spouse. So there's all sorts of reasons that it's better for people to work, but we send them signals, encourage them to retire. If we can fix some of that, and we can address immigration, and we can help support disabled workers, and we can help formerly incarcerated workers, and we can help working parents, all those things together can make a big difference in boosting our economic growth rate and improving our fiscal outlook. And while I don't have a lot of faith in Congress to be able to take this holistic approach, I think people in the thinking world at least should consider these policies together, because it is a big puzzle and we want to make sure the pieces are fitting right.
Great. Somebody asks, and I think I know the answer that you're going to give to this. Is it true that the Treasury could essentially issue a $1 trillion coin and just eliminate the debt? And if so, why don't we do that?
Well, I think we would need a $27 trillion coin to eliminate the debt for starters. But yes, a country like ours could effectively monetize our debt. Does Treasury have the authority to do it through a $1 trillion coin? I'm skeptical, but maybe. But like Congress could do it, sure. The result would either be we'd have to put it into some type of Federal Reserve account that we're paying interest on it still. In that case, we haven't really gotten rid of our debt. We've just replaced it with a different kind of debt. Or we'd have to put a lot more cash out in the economy in a way that causes massive inflation. Neither of those would be desirable, right? So we could technically convert all of our debt into cash, but either we would be doing it in name only, or we'd be doing it in a way that's massively inflationary. And then we've kind of undermined the entire point in the first place.
Christopher wants to know if another recession such as 2007 or 2020 happened again, how damaging would that be to our overall fiscal health, given where we are right now versus then?
Well, what I'm more worried about is that our fiscal health would be damaging to the next recession. Because when we've gone into recessions, we've responded with substantial fiscal stimulus. In the case of the last recession, I think too much, but a lot of it was really warranted and really important. That's harder to do when your debt is really high. And it's harder to do when you're feeling inflationary and interest rate pressures. And even though inflation seems like it's coming under control, there still may be that underlying inflationary pressure that's being held down by those interest rates. And so what I worry about is the next recession comes, and both for sort of political reasons and for economic reasons, it's harder for us to do the borrowing necessary to get through it. And then to the extent we do, yes, the questioner is right, it's going to make our bad debt situation even worse.
Fortune would like to know about your views on domestic investing, such as infrastructure, reforming the student loan system, and investments into science, and how that can play into the overall equation.
Well, I think we have sort of three major fiscal problems in this country. The first is that we are spending way more than we're collecting in revenue. And you could flip that on its head and say we're collecting way less than we're spending. The point is, the first is we have this huge gap between spending and revenue. The second is that our tax code is broken. So much of it's temporary. There's so many holes in it. And so it's not very competitive. And the third is that our budget is too consumption focused. Yes, we've increased investment, under the bipartisan infrastructure bill, under the Inflation Reduction Act to some degree. But for the most part, an ever growing share of our budget is going to pay for healthcare spending, and it's going to pay for seniors, some extremely wealthy seniors. Seniors today are the wealthiest cohort in the history of the known universe. Instead of spending money on kids or on other kinds of investment. And so I think that, to me, my biggest concern is this disconnect between spending and revenue. And so we got to get that under control or nothing else matters. But in the process, we at least need to be incrementally improving the composition of our tax code and our budget. So they're focused more on growth, more in the next generation, more on investing, and less on just boosting more consumption, because no society ever spent itself into infinite prosperity.
Serena makes the statement that in 2023, our tax revenue has substantially decreased. How do you see the correlation between revenue and human efficiency? And what can we do to encourage, what can we encourage in this area to boost the revenue and economy?
Yeah. So what's happened to our revenue between 2022 and 2023 isn't really because of anything that's happened in the sort of underlining ability to earn and ability to pay. It's been a bunch of quirky things. Especially what happened in 2022 is we had massive capital gains because of the huge stock market gains during the pandemic, and huge housing gains and significant turnover. So we had this huge one-time influx of capital gains taxes. We also had massive inflation, which boosts taxable income substantially. And so 2022 was a historically high year for revenue. It was the second highest in history as a share of the economy, but it was just a one-time surge done by goofy temporary things. 2023 was mostly coming back down to earth. Those capital gains were over and in fact replaced with some losses. That inflation sort of persisted, but we had the tax code's update to inflation. The tax code is indexed to inflation, it's just on a lag. And so 2023 was mostly a return to normal. And then we had some bad things that brought it down even further, like all this excess loss from this employee retention credit. So I'm not worried about the fall from 22 to 23. What I'm worried about is that our underlying revenue is well short of our spending. And we're not going to solve this just by cutting spending, but we're not going to solve it just by increasing revenue either. And what I also worry about is that in the near future, we have a looming expiration of tax cuts that politicians may try to extend in a way that makes our revenue situation even worse. So we got to reform the tax code, mainly by cutting tax breaks. But I think we also should look at some rate increases or surtax and things like carbon taxes, et cetera. Check out our budget blueprint. We should do it in a way that is as conducive to economic growth, to fairness, to efficiency as possible, that maintains or improves tax simplicity where possible. And yes, we're not going to raise any revenue if we don't have a vibrant economy where people want to work and where people want to invest. And so we got to continue to encourage all of that. But we're not going to encourage that sufficiently by cutting taxes. We're going to need to raise taxes.
Jim would like to know, how is Japan able to function with over 200% debt to GDP?
Well, not great. Japan has had essentially no economic growth for the last quarter century. So I'm not sure I'd look to them as an example. Their debt on a comparable basis to ours is about 180% of GDP. They're able to afford that because essentially their central bank and their domestic investors buy all the debt. They're an aberration. There's no other examples really of a country that's doing as well as Japan. And they're not even doing that well, right? They've had no growth. But there's no country that's doing as well that has a debt level even that high. It's possible we're also an aberration because the United States is the greatest economy also in the history of the known universe, right? We're the world's reserve currency. We print in our own currency. People count on us. We have a vibrant economy. Our political system, even though it seems very unstable, in a comparative sense, is relatively stable. So for all those reasons, it's possible we too could afford 180% of GDP of debt, but it's a big gamble because in that process, we're going to kill a lot of our investment. We're going to crowd out a lot of our investment. We're going to slow our economic growth. We're going to boost interest rates, and we put us at a very high risk that if interest rates rise, things will spin out of control. And a much higher risk than Japan, because even though Japan's debt is high, their projected deficits are actually quite low. They don't have these huge unfunded obligations as far as the eye can see, like we do with Social Security and Medicare. And so if things get bad for them, they can reverse course a lot easier. If we get to 180% of GDP in debt and things turn sour in the bond markets, we are in deep trouble. And a word I don't want to say on a webinar because I understand there's families on, but we're in deep trouble.
Marc, Donna would like to know why most of the focus of discussion is on Social Security and Medicare, and there's very little mention of Medicaid when talking about these type of problems.
Yeah, so I think I've tried to mention Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid together. Medicaid doesn't have quite the cost driver in it as Social Security and Medicare because Medicare costs are driven both by rising healthcare costs and by the fact that as we get older, we have more and more beneficiaries. And that's not really the case in Medicaid, except for in the long-term care space. So because Medicare is for people over age 65, its costs are exploding a lot more quickly than Medicaid is. But all three of these programs are really quite costly. All three of them are growing faster than the economy in the general case. And we ought to look to reforms to all three. And if you look again at our blueprint, you'll see that we have all sorts of changes to reform Medicare by lowering costs, but we also have changes to lower Medicaid costs. And there, because Medicaid is administered by the states, we especially focus on areas where states are essentially manipulating the federal government and cheating them out of match money. And we find this is quite costly, that, we're losing about $500 billion over the next decade because of states taking advantage of the benefit formula for things that essentially are legal cheating, and we should make into illegal cheating.
Z Heffron wants to know, does America's personal debt play any role in our worsening federal situation, such as student loans, credit card debt, or weakening revenue?
Well, I do think that high personal debt is one thing that contributes to higher overall interest rates, right? And it can contribute to some financial issues. And in that sense, it matters. It also matters to the extent that interest costs are deductible, like mortgage interest, et cetera. But in general, these are sort of separate questions. They really matter if you look kind of at the macro economy and finance, but personal debt isn't contributing in a really direct way to the government debt. It's just adding yet another problem on top of it.
Great. We are getting a little bit short on time, so we have time for maybe just a couple more questions. Ed B would like to know, how far are we from being in a situation similar to that of Argentina?
I don't think we're going to become Argentina, because unlike Argentina, we have a credible Federal Reserve. And unlike Argentina, even if irresponsibly, we sort of credibly manage our policy, right? And so the closest we got to it in recent was in 2021, when we decided to put another $2 trillion into the fire when there was already sort of a very inflationary environment. And that was bad, but the Federal Reserve then stepped in and raised interest rates from 0 to 5%. And at the same time, policymakers, even though they didn't reduce deficits substantially, they didn't extend those deficit increases. And so now inflation's looking like it's headed back towards normal. I want to knock on wood, because it may bounce back up in January and February, but it's looking like it's headed back towards normal. So I don't think we have a very high risk of becoming Argentina. The way that could happen is if our debt gets so out of control, and this would have to start with high interest rates, leading to this sort of spin out of control, that it basically becomes clear the only way we get out of it is to inflate our way out. I sure hope it doesn't come to that. I have more faith in politicians to act before then. Even if they act too late, I think they can act before we're in some kind of inflation crisis.
A couple of people have asked this. Do you have any thoughts on kind of off-balance sheet liabilities, or if that plays any role in the overall fiscal situation?
Yeah, so I mean, the federal government has all sorts of different liabilities that has different levels of connection to. So for example, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the housing agencies, have trillions of dollars of debt. They're backed up by assets, but effectively the government is the last resort on those. But in some ways, the government is also the lender of last resort for the private sector. We saw this in COVID, when the government bailed out essentially every small business, or we saw this in the Great Recession when they bailed out the banks. We have all sorts of different kinds of contingent liabilities, and I don't think there's a good way to measure them, but we should at least be aware of them and understand that whatever debts you're seeing in the books, there's something out there. Something out there that could make things even worse. And the best way to be prepared for it is to have your on-the-books debt be under control.
Great. I'm going to end with two call to action type questions. The first one from Gordon. He wants to know, what's your summary? What should we ask our Congress people to do to fix this?
Support Fiscal Commission. Like, there are lots of things you could ask them, but let's just make the ask very simple. There's Fiscal Commission bill, Peter Sazinga in the House, Romney Manchin in the Senate. They should support the bill. Fiscal commissions aren't a guarantee that will solve the problem, but they've worked in the past. We use fiscal commissions to save Social Security, fiscal commissions to reduce government waste, to reorganize this after our Homeland Security and national security apparatus after 9/11. to come up with ideas for reforming the tax code, to close military bases that were unnecessary and just there for political purposes. Commissions can work. I served on 2 of them, including the Simpson-Bowles Commission in 2010, that didn't fix the fiscal situation, but forced President Obama and Speaker Boehner to the table and totally changed the conversation. I think our best chance in the coming years is some kind of fiscal commission. So call your member, tell them they should support the fiscal commission legislation in the House or Senate, whichever member they're calling, because it's our last best hope.
And then finally, Tom wants to know, Marc, will you please run for federal office, House or Senate, you choose?
I don't think that's such a good idea, and I don't think that a lot of people would vote for my particular platform that advocates for higher taxes and lower spending. Plus, I'd have to pick a political party, and right now, as you saw from our chart, I'm pretty fed up with both of them having added 77% of GDP to our debt on a bipartisan basis. But I appreciate the compliment.
Marc, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to everybody, answer so many questions. This was a great conversation. A lot of people were also asking, are we going to be sending out the slides and a recording of this conversation? Yes, on both. They will both be posted to our website, and you'll all be getting an email with follow-up afterwards. Thank you so much, and have an excellent day.